Let's be clear, there's a distinctive reason why white people feel threatened by blacks' freedom.
In the years before the Civil War, the South was a society divided not only between blacks and whites, but among whites themselves. The region was dominated both socially and politically by 1,733 families who owned more than 100 slaves each. They were called the planter aristocracy, and they lived in a world of opulent mansions and mint juleps.
Black businesses grew at a faster pace than any other North Carolina city. In 1897, over 1,000 African Americans owned some sort of property in Wilmington. The city's African American population was enriched by schools, wealth, and inherited status.
1,733 families owned at least 100 slaves and more, and all the legal land throughout the entire South prior to the Civil War. 1897, just 27 years out of race-based cattle bondage, over 1,000 blacks have already accumulated property in one county, Wilmington County, North Carolina.
But most white Southerners weren't wealthy enough to own slaves. In fact, 2/3 of all Southerners owned no slaves at all. This part of the population was known as yeoman farmers.
Slave trading produced an allegory institution called slave renting or slave hiring. Some whites developed a need for short-term slave labor, but did not wish to own slaves. Other whites who could not afford to own slaves did the next best thing. They rented slaves. Owners generally profited from this practice, and renters had the labor of unskilled or skilled slaves without the cost of permanent ownership. Most were skilled slaves, including tailors, barbers, cooks, carpenters, and blacksmiths. The city newspapers printed notices offering the services of skilled slaves for hire by the month or the year. The practice of slave hiring in Charleston became so complex that many slaves wore a badge around their neck with a number indicating their particular skills or craft. The Charleston City Council taxed these badges.
The planter aristocracy owned the best land, forcing the yeoman farmers to scratch out a living in the less fertile backcountry and mountain valleys that remained.
The expense of slave ownership and prices for slaves rose between 1820 and 1850 in most regions. Charleston, South Carolina, more than any other city, became the capital for slave hiring or renting, to as much as $600 per year for a skilled slave. And in 1845, the South Carolina General Assembly passed a law making it illegal to rent or hire a slave. Few masters or renters adhered to the legislation, and renting and hiring continued unabated in and around Charleston, and some slaves earned money in this elaborate process.
Since they didn't own land, they could not hold political office, which meant they had less representation in both national and state governments. In addition, people who owned slaves were often allowed to include their slaves when calculating population, giving them a huge advantage in their state legislatures.
And also silencing non-slaveholding poor white people, very often in both state politics and in national politics.
But most poor yeoman farmers didn't blame the slave system for this vast inequality. In fact, most poor whites defended the institution of slavery, knowing in their hearts that at least they were superior to slaves in one way. The whites had their freedom.
Now, what I want us to look at right here is, first, look at what this say. Received estimate of the farm labor force, 1800 to 1860. This is the labor report for the 1860s prior to slavery. Now, I want you to look at, what you look at is this owl right here is the labor force non-slave. Right here, we look, this Alabama, 6,000 non-slaves employed, 166,000 slaves employed. Females employed in Alabama, 1,511, right? Males from 10 to 15, which is most likely slaves, 17,901. Europeans was grossly unemployed. Let's continue to go down. Arkansas, Europeans, employment, 5,400. Slaves, 23,000. Now let's go down here to this North Carolina. Whites, non-slaves unemployment rate is 25,000. Remember, you still had blacks that was free still working down there. So the non-slave employment was 25,000 in North Carolina. The slave labor workforce was 135,000, right? The children from 10 to 15, which you know was slave, was 22,000, right? Women, be clear, slavery was used to oppress whites politically, socially, and economically. Still, over 258,000 whites fought and died with pride for an institution that impoverished them and their family for generations. What's frightening most is whites' willingness to kill, die, and sacrifice their children for white elites and ask for nothing in return. The Revolutionary War is a prime example. 21,000 poor whites died fighting the Revolutionary War. Started over a grievance the elites had with the crown of England. America, land-owning aristocrats objected to taxing without representation. Washington raised an army of poor whites to fight their war against the crown of England in order to gain independence, and then denied poor whites the right to vote for 100 years.
The planter aristocracy owned the best land, forcing the yeoman farmers to scratch out a living in the less fertile backcountry and mountain valleys that remained.
So the colonists was shipping goods to Europe, and they was bringing back their indentured servants over to America. The Europeans, blacks was already here. Slavery did not become race-based when they identified the difference in how you can treat a slave versus an indentured servant, and the courts labeled a black a slave and a white an indentured servant. And I will show you how the courts did this.
Anthony Johnson was a free man with his own land. Virginia court records indicate a woman named Mary, and together they had 4 children. The Johnsons lived on and operated a 250-acre plantation along Virginia's eastern shore. Virginia law stated that landowners would receive 1 servant for each 50-acre plot of land they owned. The Johnsons claimed 5 servants, 4 of whom were white. A white neighbor named George Parker had the court free one of Johnson's indentured servants. Johnson asked the courts to re-examine their decision. The court did, and once again ruled in Johnson's favor. The servant, John Casor, was placed back on the Johnson plantation.
African-American brother was actually on 4 white, 1 black. White at this time, because of the Bacon Rebellion, where blacks and white indentured servants together had an uprising that the white elites had decided to transfer slavery over to race-based. They had also had other issues keeping track of escaped runaway indentured servants. So they had to do other things such as shave their head bald. So they figured, okay, we can use the black person's skin color as a marker to always identify a slave and to always identify that person's plot in life. This is what ended slavery from white. They created a certain code in which you can treat indentured servants. You could not whip and beat indentured servants. You did not have them for life. So they became more profitable to continuously kidnap the Africans, who they called the natives, back and then go back into enslave us. This is why I say white people had 150-something year head start on black when it comes to freedom.
By the 1670s, Anthony Johnson passed away and left his large land holdings to his children. But by then, Virginia had begun to change. With the African population in Virginia rapidly increasing, laws were being made to restrict any glimpse of freedom for Africans in the Virginia colony. In less than 5 years after Anthony Johnson's death, the same Virginia courts that had ruled in his favor a few years before ruled that African people were alien, were separate from Virginia's citizens, and therefore could not own land.
Whites had 150 years head start on blacks. The reason why you see a lot of Irish as police officers is because when they was released from indentured servitude, they was poor. So what they had to do was they patrolled our community. They controlled the plantations, capturing runaway slaves for the white people for scraps. What did they resent? They resented not only losing our labor, but losing our skill, losing our knowledge, This is how they survived their entire time throughout slavery. The entire time the Europeans have been in America, they have needed the knowledge of growing, food, building, and everything else to survive here in America. What do you think Thanksgiving was about? It was about to starve. It was about to die. Blacks came and saved them. I said blacks, not Indians. I said blacks, Africans.
When the last of the Union troops marched out of the South in 1877, most white Southerners heaved a sigh of relief. They believed that the economic situation would improve once the Army left. They were sorely mistaken.
Well, the reason why Europeans feared us coming out of slavery so much is because African Americans did all the work for them, even the poor whites, even the ones who could not afford slaves. So we was the ones who planted the fields to everybody. So they did not know how to farm when blacks was released from slavery. We was the ones who did all the building. We was the blacksmiths. We had all the skills. They hadn't worked for 100 or something years. This is why they could not succeed. The only reason why whites was able to do well in the North is because they had jobs working for factories. When it came to living free and independent, whites could not do that. They had been enslaved their entire existence on earth. This is why they fight so hard to keep blacks enslaved, because our freedom makes them fear that they will go back into slavery, which is what happened. They went back into financial slavery. They went back into indentured servitude. They went back to working off a debt. That is what America is based off now. It's based off of credit. We are now back in a system of financial servitude, and white people led us back into financial servitude because they could not survive outside of working for white people. And so white people had to give them money, which they could not pay back because they was not able to be producers. So because they could not be producers, they was constantly just loaned large amounts of money. By them being given all this money on credit, what it did was it priced everything out of range. So now your labor is not good enough to make you buy anything because they're study printing money, giving it to the white people, making the things that you need out of life too expensive because these white people had jobs that they had to work for the next 30, 40 years so they would be able to pay off all this debt. They was back into indentured servitude. And because they got so much credit and they printed up so much money, they made living outside of that system impossible. So everybody had to go into debt or use credit in order to maintain your life. And those who do not have that credit are living in poverty.
Wilmington, prior to November 1898, was what the New South could be at the cusp of the 20th century.
There was an unusual degree of Black prosperity.
In Wilmington, there were successful Black entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, but also Black elected officials. And for a time, that was true throughout the state. Take a look at the politicians on this poster of the 1889 North Carolina House of Representatives. Here at the bottom are Black Republican representatives, some from Wilmington. North Carolina also sent 4 Black Republicans to the U.S. Congress between 1875 and 1899.
Blacks was capable of being self-sufficient. We was capable of repeatedly building our own communities. We had the skills coming up out of slavery. We had the work ethic coming up out of slavery.
Oklahoma had 45 Black towns and municipalities. It was capital of Black self-determination.
So as a result, a number of enterprising young Black entrepreneurs started to create a business district.
In 1905, the Greenwood District gets its first business, a grocery store on the corner of Greenwood Avenue and Archer Street. From this humble start, Greenwood soon flourishes into the vital, exciting center of African-American life in Tulsa. By 1921, it is a place of limitless opportunities, both economic and social.
I liken it to a city within a city. Greenwood itself is an area of nearly 40 square blocks with individual neighborhoods, individual churches that have their own parishes.
About 40 to 45 blocks of a residential community with a business district.
Southern businessmen looked to the devastated South and saw opportunity. Land was cheap, and factories quickly turned Southern resources like cotton into profit. But the profits went north, leaving the South in a state of poverty.
Poor whites were in a dire position, just like former slaves, and they had to try to get back on their feet.
At that time, Greenwood had business.
Everything was happening there. We had the Dreamland Theater, we had drugstores, we had dance halls, pool rooms, shine parlors. That's where everybody just hung out.
People go down one side of Greenwood and up the other, and you could see the fashions and all of that.
During this era, Tulsa is essentially two cities, the black North End and the white South End.
And that was segregation days,
Burdened by debt and overcome by their resentment of landowners' power, poor whites became angrier and angrier. Their frustration fueled intense racism as they sought to elevate their own lowly status by degrading their black peers.
Many African American communities in the United States were thriving in the 1910s and 20s. But the high level of home ownership in Greenwood made Tulsa's black district distinctive.
Now, for some white people, a black person with any wealth, then as well as today, is something that created jealousy. When Oklahoma became a state in 1907, there was great rejoicing throughout the state and through the territory, and amongst black Oklahomans as well. But very soon, the racial climate started to change.
After the Constitutional Congress, after statehood was approved, the first bill segregated the state.
Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We were all meant to shine as children do. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others.
Let's be clear. The emancipation of African Americans opened up a large array of freedoms for all of Americans. First, you have the 13th Amendment, which bans slavery for everyone, right? Then you have what is called the 14th Amendment, which gives everyone in America equal protection under the law. Then right immediately after that, you have what is the 15th Amendment, which gives all American, all American-born citizens the right to vote. The emancipation of African Americans ended a 240-year Jim Crow that whites had suffered under as well, where they could not reach the status of white elites because they were still stuck under a class system. The first time in American history blacks and whites allied together caused the Bacon Rebellion. The second time blacks and whites had a chance, right, to remove the elites from their position was after the Civil War. But due to whites' insecurity, the elite whites was able to turn poor whites against their very allies. This is why blacks have to completely separate from whites. It's because they cannot be trusted. They have continuously worked against their own self-interest in order to hurt us.